Hello and welcome back to Swamp Mechanicking with Stuzzbot. Today's fun challenge involves Mazza's Mini, which, with the impeccable timing for which bastard motor cars are famed, decided to break a front suspension spring on the very day before we had it booked in for the MOT. So I'm going to have to get this strut out and get a replacement from eBay. Suspension struts clamped into the hub assembly here, and the bolt for the clamp is at the back, and according to some bloke whose video I watched, it's prone to being rusted solid and shearing right off. So that's something to look forward to. This nut attaching the trailing arm to the suspension strut also needs removed. That should be relatively straightforward, although it's a bit tricky because the centre threaded part is free floating, so it needs to be held in place with an Allen key while you loosen off the outer nut. On the big clamp bolt, apparently it's the head that shears off, as it's usually rusted solid into the housing. Given everything a good soak with penetrating oil. Unfortunately, I've run out of plus gas, which is my go-to rust buster, so I've ordered some more on Amazon and that'll be here tomorrow. But in the meantime, I'll have to make do with this 3-in-1, which I don't think's as good, but it's all I've got to hand at the mo. Under the bonnet there's 3 more bolts here holding the top of the strut in place. I'm not expecting these to give any trouble as they're pretty clean looking and protected from the elements tucked up in here, but we'll give them a wee squirt anyway. I'm afraid a lot of the action, for want of a better word, in this video is going to happen off screen because it involves two-handed wrestling and swearing, and I can't hold the camera at the same time. But I've managed to loosen off the nut on the big clamp bolt without too much trauma. Now for the bolt head itself. This is where if it's going to shear, it'll shear. So wish me luck, Skip, I'm going in. Well, once again the drama, or lack thereof, happened off screen, but I freed off the bolt itself without shearing it. I heaved on it for a bit with a socket and a cheater bar, and it really felt like it was going to shear off, so I just switched using the impact gun. Thought, what the hell, and after 2 or 3 goes with that, it began to turn. Just one slight problem though. As you can see, the bolt's turning freely now, but it's not backing out of the clamp. I've just run into my first roadblock here. The trailing arm nuts are 16mm, which is a really odd size. I've only got one 16mm spanner, and unfortunately its head is just too fat to fit in this annoyingly shaped bracket here and get a good grip on the nut. In the meantime, I thought maybe I could undo the bottom end, which should allow me to remove the strut with the trailing arm still attached, and then get the trailing arm off later when I've got a skinnier headed spanner. I've got the bottom end of the trailing arm undone, but it's jammed in place here due to the angle of the dangle of the suspension, so I'm going to need to jack up the wishbone a bit to level things out and then see if it'll push out. I'm convinced German car makers design things like this as their revenge for World War II. Because I used to run into this kind of thing all the time when working on my old Volkswagen vans. I've jacked up the suspension to level the end of the trailing arm out, and now it pushes through easily enough, except with sadistic Teutonic precision it just knocks up against the stub axle and stops it from pushing completely out. Right, I think that'll do me for today. I can't really proceed any further without getting the top off the trailing arm undone. Here we are the next morning. I got up early and nipped into town and scored this set of 4 ring spanners for $17.99. Nice compact head on these new spanners, and it fits easy into the bracket. So once again, Fritz, your evil machinations are scuppered by plucky British, made in China with a fake Nordic brand name, ingenuity. Off camera again, I got the top of the trailing arm undone. I thought for a horrible minute or three I was going to fail here, because when the nut was about halfway off and it was fighting every millimetre of turn like it was cross-threaded, the Allen key I had wedged in the front started slipping and I couldn't undo the nut anymore. Luckily, inspecting the other end, which I unfastened yesterday, I noticed that the back end, or the back side of the ball jointy bit, has a squared off face. So I was able to reach round the back and get a spanner onto that to hold the ball joint from turning. Incidentally, once I got this nut off and looked at the trailing arm more closely, I saw that the centre was a recess to take a Torx bit, not a hex, which is why my Allen key started slipping when I was giving it welly factor 10. Now, before I start battering things down below with a lump hammer, I'll just get these bolts on the top undone in case I forget. I also need to lower the jack which is holding the suspension up so there's room for the hub assembly to drop. And finally get this main bolt on the clamp bracket out, as it passes through an eyelet on the struts they won't separate with the bolt in place. This turned out to be a bit of a palaver. As I showed earlier, the bolt would spin freely enough but just wouldn't budge as regards backing out. So in the end I tapped the nut end with a hammer while spinning the head with the impact gun, and that sort of managed to back the bolt out enough, and then I could wedge a spanner between the head and the bracket and use that as a lever to kind of push it out while spinning it with the impact gun. Once all the fasteners were out, it's time for the mindless violence to begin. I started initially tapping and then increasingly bashing the hub assembly with the lump hammer to try and force it down and off the strut. It took a while with the hub seemingly not moving at all, until eventually I noticed this wee tide line showing where it used to sit, and I was assured it was moving, albeit very reluctantly. Once I knew that it was moving in the right direction, I just kept bashing away with the hammer, and eventually the strut popped out of the hub assembly. It was then a simple task to wiggle the whole strut out from under the wheel arch. There's the bracket the strut was clamped into. It was actually pretty clean inside, but I gave it a wee polish with 240 grit emery cloth anyway. I also propped the suspension up with a jack again and a block of wood under the brake disc, just to stop them putting any strain on the brake line and the sensor cable. And there's the offending strut removed from the vehicle. As you can see, the spring's completely knackered, broken in half. I think they might just have picked up on that at the MOT. Here we are about 4 days later, and the new to us strut has just arrived. It was only 40 quid off eBay with free postage, which isn't bad. It was a bit mucky when it came, so I've given it a wee rub down with a wet flannel, or a wire brush actually, and it looks to be in pretty decent shape. Right, before I go any further, I'm just going to show you what's around the back of this thing, so you can get an idea of what you're wrestling with when working blind. So here's the wee bracket on the back, and that slots in the open end of the clamp thingy in the hub assembly. And that big bolt that passes through the clamp goes through this gap in the bracket too. So that's what you've got to get aligned properly when you're battering this all back together. And here's the clamp that the bottom of the suspension strut fits into. You can see the gap at the back where that bracket on the strut slides in there, and the big bolt goes through the clamp and the hole in that bracket. Also, before I start trying to wrestle this back together again, I think I mentioned earlier that the couple of videos I watched in this said that you needed an Allen key to hold the centre of the trailing arm ball joint from turning while you loosen the nut. And when I tried it, the Allen key started slipping once things got tight, and I thought I'd rounded off the inset on the trailing arm. Well, once I got the trailing arm disconnected and looked at it closely out of the shadow of the wheel arch, I saw the centre socket was actually for a Torx bit, not an Allen key. I'm kind of making this up as I go along here, trying to work out how to manoeuvre this strut into position. So to hold it roughly in place while I fiddle here, I'm just loosely hanging it off the top 3 nuts, just finger tightening them a couple of turns, so there's still plenty of room to wiggle things about down below. Looking underneath, the hub assembly's way too high, so I think it's time to get the jack out from under the wishbone arm and let everything hang down as far as it'll droop. Okay, with a bit of more off-camera wiggling and wrestling, I've managed to get the bottom of the strut resting on the top of the bracket. I made a remark here after measuring the distance to the tide line in the old one. That'll give me a rough idea how far down into the clamp the strut needs to go. I'm not looking forward to this bit at all, as it's going to involve hitting things with a lump hammer while trying to avoid hitting other things with a lump hammer, and also hoping that the thing I'm actually wanting to hit with a lump hammer is going to be tough enough to take a hammer in. I'm not sure I'm making much of any progress here. This is a ridiculously tight fit. I've greased the inside of the bracket and thoroughly cleaned and sanded the bottom of the strut, but they just don't want to come together at all. Things aren't helped by the fact there's very limited access for me to get in here with a hammer. I can pretty much only get anywhere near it from this side. So what I'm doing is jacking up the suspension under the hub here, which before I started I thought would be a really straightforward way to do this, but of course now that I'm pressing things up the way, as opposed to when I was hammering down to remove the old strut, all that's happening is that the spring and the shock are compressing. What I'm hoping is that if I continue jacking up the suspension bit by bit and then continue to tap away at the clamp here with the hammer, some combination of that shock impact and downward force of the spring will gradually force the strut into the clamp. Well, I've been banging away for a while now, as the actress said to the bishop, and although it's painfully slow, we are making progress. As you can see, the strut's now far enough into the clamp that the wee bracket on the back's just starting to slide into place. So maybe 2 or 3 centimetres more to go and we should be there. Some more minutes later and we have the scent of victory in our delicately flared nostrils. The strut's finally persuaded into position and the clamping bolt's through. So now I just need to tighten that up, then reconnect the trailing arm. I've got a PDF of the workshop manual for the Mini at home, and I checked the torque settings for that clamp bolt, and it's given us tightening torque 31, 35, 1 AZ. I've no feckin' idea what that means, so I'm just going to go for the old standby German torque of Guten Tight, or the Roman equivalent Titus Feck. Given it's taken me about half an hour twatting the hub with a lump hammer to get the damn strut into it, I seriously doubt the two would part company even without the bolt there anyway. So I'm sure a few Newton meters either way won't make any difference. Next challenge is to get the trailing arm into its wee bracket at the top of the strut here. So that should just be a simple matter of jacking the suspension up again till those two line up and then bolting it back together. And that was that. Remembering of course to lift the bonnet and give the 3 nuts on top of the strut their final tighten as well. Wheel back on, Mini Bluey down off the jacks, tools packed away, and it's time to see if we're back in business.